There is silence at the center of the Imperium. Not the silence of peace nor the hush of death, but something older, a silence that rules. 10,000 years have passed since the Emperor of mankind last spoke. His empire still trembles beneath the weight of his name. His armies still kill in the echo of his command, and his light still burns across the void like a wound that refuses to close. Yet none have heard his voice. Not the custodian guard who watch his throne. Not the high lords who govern in his stead. Not even the psychers whose minds are ash from hearing every other voice in the galaxy. Only the silence remains, immense, deliberate, unbroken. To some it is mercy. To others punishment. To most it is the sound of faith fossilized into law. But in that silence hides the oldest question of all. What happens when a god refuses to speak? If this silence haunts you as it haunts the Imperium, if you've ever wondered what it means for a civilization to worship a voice it can no longer hear, then keep your vigil with us. Strengthen this signal, share it, and subscribe your faith to the flame that still flickers on Terra. Every listener keeps the light alive, and in the darkness of the 41st millennium, light is the last true act of defiance. There are places on Terra where the air itself has memory. Beneath the stone vaults of the Imperial Palace, deeper than the cathedrals, deeper even than the black basalt archives of the Sigillite, lies the Sanctum Imperialis, the chamber of the Golden Throne. No light enters here that has not been consecrated. No sound lives that is not allowed. The silence presses down like the weight of oceans, broken only by the rhythmic hiss of promethium-fed conduits and the slow mechanical respiration of the throne itself. It is a breathing machine, and that breath is the pulse of a god. In the flicker of the lumen pylons, shadows move across relics that have outlived entire civilizations. Custodian guards stand among them, their gold armor reflecting the dull glow of the throne's life support systems. Each man a monument of devotion carved from human perfection. Every few hours, though hours have no meaning here, the custodian's change shifts. They do not speak, for there is nothing left to say. They perform their duties by motion alone, each action codified by 10,000 years of ritual precision. One among them, newly anointed and nameless to all but his superiors, approaches the central causeway. He has been trained for centuries for this task, to look upon the Emperor's withered form and not lose his mind. His armor gleams, his soul trembles. He steps forward as incense thick as fog rolls down from the ceiling vents. The smell is old and metallic, tinged with the sweetness of burned myrrh and the faint stench of oil. The world outside is measured by war and empire, but here the universe exists in the pause between two mechanical breaths. He stops at the edge of the dais. The golden throne looms before him like a mountain sculpted by divinity and madness. Cables thicker than a man's body snake into the Emperor's frame, feeding, draining, sustaining. The light from the plasma conduits paints his desiccated skin in gold and violet. His eyes are closed, but the air shudders around him with the pressure of thought too vast for comprehension. The custodian feels the echo of that power in the back of his skull. Not words, not commands, just awareness. To stand before the Emperor is to stand before gravity itself. The initiate recites the litany of the silent watch and places his hand over his chest plate. His heartbeat falters, caught in the same rhythm as the throne's mechanical breath. For one terrible instant he feels the synchronization complete, his body's pulse becoming the echo of a god's dying respiration. There are adepts in the shadows, draped in crimson and black, their faces half replaced by augmetics. The tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus maintain the throne not as engineers but as worshippers. Each screw they tighten, each sigil they burn into the metal is a prayer disguised as labor. The machine was never meant to function for 10 millennia, yet it endures. A relic of an age when science and faith were one language. The adepts murmur Binharic hymns as they record the flow of power through conduits that lead into the Astronomican far above. Every variable is sacred. Every spark of electricity is the residue of a miracle, and through it all the Emperor remains unmoving, his silence thicker than the air. The initiate had imagined glory here. He had imagined radiance. But what he feels is weight. The Emperor's presence does not fill the chamber with light. It empties it of meaning. He understands now why so few are permitted within this sanctum. It is not for secrecy, it is for mercy. No mortal mind can witness divinity sustained by machines and remain whole. He bows lower, whispering the final words of his vigil. By your silence we endure. His breath trembles as he rises, and for an instant, he swears the Emperor's lips part. Just slightly. A trick of the lumen flare, perhaps, but it is enough. The custodian steps back, armor clattering softly, as if the world itself might shatter under sound. The attendants record fluctuations in the Emperor's vital fields. Microscopic, insignificant, the kind that could be dismissed as mechanical drift. They are logged without comment. Yet in the lower vaults, far beneath the throne's base, servitors begin to stir. Their data slates flicker with unreadable code, and vox grills murmur words that do not belong to any human tongue. The adepts mark it as interference, but one of them, an old magos with a broken vox and trembling augmetic hands, looks up at the conduits and feels his faith curdle into awe. The machine's rhythm has changed. It is still breathing, but now it listens between breaths. Far above, in the throne's shadowed periphery, the custodian hears it too. Not a voice, not a sound, but a pause that feels intentional. He raises his head, tears gathering behind his eyes, though he cannot say why. The light from the conduits dims, then returns. He waits for an alarm, a chant, an explanation. None comes. Only the endless breath of the Emperor continues, measured, merciless, eternal. He exhales, his lungs empty and grateful, unaware that his own breathing now follows a pattern that matches the pulse of the throne. Outside the sanctum, across the ash-coated plains of Terra, billions live and die never hearing the silence. They imagine the Emperor's voice carried on sermons, on orders, on the roar of orbital bombardments. But here, where he still is, silence is truth. The silence is the law. And the law does not explain itself. For all their faith, no one truly knows whether the Emperor dreams, or whether the mind inside that corpse machine still remembers the species that worships him. Yet when the custodian leaves his post and the doors close behind him, he glances once over his shoulder and swears he sees light behind those closed eyes. A faint shimmer, like a sunrise remembering itself through fog. Perhaps it was imagination. Perhaps not. The custodian will never speak of it, but later that night, when he removes his helm and kneels to pray, he realizes that he can no longer hear his own heartbeat. Only the throne's. Only the slow mechanical breathing of a god that refuses to die. The initiate's vigil did not end when he left the dais. It followed him through corridors flanked by statues older than most languages, through sensorium cloisters where the air was so heavy with incense that breathing felt like drinking, through galleries of ossified banners whose threads had darkened to the color of dried blood. The golden throne's rhythm lingered beneath every sound. It found the hollows of his bones and made a home there. When he reached the antechamber to remove his helm, the world outside the visor struck him as too loud. Boot leather and whispering silk. The soft clack of data slate keys, the flutter of prayer strips pinned to the walls. He realized with a slow rising dread that these noises only seemed loud because the machine's breath had grown louder still. Not in volume, but in intimacy, as if the silence had stepped closer. The tech priests called a maintenance rite that would last for 6 full cycles. No words for hours, only the language of tools. The senior among them, a gaunt magos whose voxynth hissed between syllables, was named Ilith Kadesh. He had served beneath the throne long enough to watch augurs he installed become relics, long enough to outlive disciples who died of doctrine before age. He led the rite with hands that trembled when not engaged. Stripped of ceremony, their labor looked almost human. Coolant lines opened like veins and sutured again with sacred clamps. Lumen baffles polished in reverent circles. The slow inspection of rune-etched capacitors so old their script had softened into memory. Every turn of a wrench was matched by a whispered Benharic reply from the machine spirits. And sometimes, more often than Kadesh would have admitted, the replies seemed timed to the initiate's breath. Beneath the dais, where the throne's foundations tunneled into black, servitors worked by reflex. Their flesh was a rumor beneath cables and plates, their faces silvered masks stamped with the imperial aquila. Data scribes recorded currents that no apprentice outside this sanctum would ever see. On their slates, numbers stuttered, corrected, stuttered again, as if an unseen hand insisted upon a rhythm no algorithm could justify. Kadesh reviewed the feed and found a gap that was not a gap at all, more a lingering. 2 heartbeats of unaccounted stillness between the surge of one conduit and the surge of the next. He ran the sequence thrice. The stillness remained. He marked it as thermal drift because the rite demanded a label. then marked it again in his private memory as something that does not have one. The initiate returned to the outer perimeter and took up the watch with 3 veterans whose names were carved in high Gothic on the inside of their bracers, a custom as old as the first oath. They did not ask him what he had seen. They would not have asked even if they had mouths for it. But one of them, a custodian with a scar that bisected his left eye and continued flawlessly across his helm, stepped close enough that their pauldrons touched. In the collision of gold, the initiate felt a faint thrum pass through the plates, a shared vibration that was not voice and not command. He stared past the veteran's shoulder at the colossi lining the nave, Primarchs frozen mid-stride, saints with iron tears, and fought the urge to kneel again like a penitent child. He did not kneel. He adjusted his stance to bring his weight back over his heels and learned in that small correction how one balances beneath a mountain. A procession entered then, robed adepts of the Ministorum carrying reliquaries whose glass fronts reflected the throne in 1,000 trembling fragments. They moved with a solemn economy, a choreography perfected over centuries of not daring to touch the thing they served. The reliquaries were not for the Emperor. Nothing was for him any longer that he did not already possess. They were for the witnesses, for the comfort of men who could not reconcile the machine that breathes with the God who will not. When the procession passed, the initiate noticed one reliquary remained behind, set upon a plinth of black basalt at the edge of the causeway. Inside the glass, a strip of parchment the width of a finger flickered with residual lumen. He could not read the script from where he stood. He did not move closer. He did not need to. The words felt legible on his tongue, as if memory had reached forward to meet them. Hours, or some holier unit of time. Later, a shock ran through the understructures like a sigh the size of a continent. The lumen pylons dimmed and did not flare back in the usual heartbeat. Darkness gathered in the hollows of ornament until statues vanished and the throne itself became a silhouette of wires against a deeper night. For the first time since his anointing, the initiate felt fear without the chastening edge of shame. It rose clean and bright like cold water breaking over a fevered brow. He tightened his gauntlets not to steady his hands but to make them hurt. Around him, custodians shifted a fractional degree toward the dais. Across from him, Kadesh lifted a hand in a gesture that looked like prayer until the fingers articulated into a pattern of machine code. The systems returned in stages, coolant valves first, then the pilgrim hum of the conduits, then the breath, thin at the edges and thick in the core, drawing the room back from a brink that none would name. Alarms did not sound because alarms do not exist here. In their place, liturgies quickened. Acolytes whispered the oath of circuits twice through. Kadesh leaned close to a panel whose paint had worn away where his predecessors had once leaned, and pressed a contact stylus to a rune that should not be pressed. The rune remained dark. He did not press again. He withdrew the stylus and tucked it under a cable as if hiding a sin. A scribe dropped his data slate. The clatter rang too clearly. In that sharp ring, the initiate heard something behind the machine's exhale, a texture as fine as dust motes drifting in a sunbeam. Not word, not thought, but a contour, the suggestion of shape delineated by what refuses to cross it. He looked to the Emperor and felt for the width of a pulse that the skin on his face grew warm, like a man leaning too close to a furnace mouth. He took one step forward before discipline yanked him back by the spine. Across the chasm of golden shadow, nothing had changed. The desiccated lips were still, the eyes closed, the cables perfect in their hunger. When the rite ended, Kadesh approached the perimeter. Tech priests rarely addressed custodians without need. He stopped just beyond the threshold where their responsibilities touch and raised his hands, palms outward, to show he carried no tool. His vox gave his voice a ruined gentleness. "We have added 3 redundant lattices to the tertiary regulation core," he said as if conveying a trivial supply matter. "You will not see them. That is the point." The initiate inclined his helm. The magos hesitated as if testing the weight of a sentence and then did not speak it. His augmetic eyes clicked once, twice, like the closing of a small book, and he turned away. In the dormitory that passes for rest, the initiate unsealed his armor in silence and set each piece upon the rack in the order he had been taught, when he was a boy whose name he no longer has. He sat upon the cot and expected the day's images to come for him. The ligatured cables, the reliquaries whisper, the darkness that had a shape. None did. What came instead was the rhythm, patient and immense, filling his lungs with a breath he had not chosen. He counted without meaning to. He matched the count to the machine's cycle without meaning to. When he realized this, he placed his hand flat against his chest and found his heart patient as a metronome in a cathedral. He pressed harder until the ribs complained, until pain recut the boundary between himself and the thing he served. The pain helped, but it did not restore the old silence. That, he understood now, is gone forever the first time you stand within the throne's shadow and feel it listening. He slept and dreamed of corridors lit by a single lumen that never exhausted its oil. In the dream, he walked toward the light without moving. The floor remembered the shape of his step and carried him. When he woke, his mouth tasted of ash and lemon oil, and the air in the dormitory seemed thinner by one prayer. He rose before the klaxon and returned himself to gold. Above him, beyond stone and sanctity, the Astronomican burned its daylight into the storm. Beneath him, deeper than even Kadesh's augurs could chart, the great machine that keeps a god in this world inhaled again and held the breath of thought longer than before. Far above Terra's surface, in the hollow spine of the Imperial Palace, there exists a place few know and none envy, the Astronomican. It is the lighthouse of mankind, the blazing psychic torch that pierces the warp and guides every Imperial vessel through the storms of unreality. But its light is not generated by machinery alone. It is fed by voices, by the minds and souls of 1,000 psychers chained in rows like offerings, their bodies sustained only to be consumed. Each day they die in silence so that the galaxy may not. The choir chambers are not built for comfort. They are built for endurance. The walls are coated with blackened gold, etched with prayer geometry designed to hold sound and thought within the same cage. The air trembles with psychic pressure, thick as water, vibrating with the agony of unseen frequencies. At the center of this storm sits the choir master, a gaunt figure named Safil Thane, whose eyes have been replaced by polished augmetic lenses to prevent him from seeing the warp directly. He can no longer perceive the physical world, but he hears everything, the pulse of the Astronomican, the hum of the Golden Throne's conduits far below, and the dying screams of the psychers whose minds become fuel. Each morning begins the same. Servitors drag fresh initiates into the choir's galleries, prisoners, pilgrims, volunteers, the unfortunates of a species that produces too many souls for its own salvation. They are bound into iron thrones shaped like organs, their spines fused to the machine by neural spikes. When the activation hymn begins, their thoughts merge. Individuality disintegrates. The Astronomican feeds. For most, death is instant. For some, it takes hours. Hours spent floating in the blinding awareness of the Emperor's light before burning away entirely. The scent of ozone and blood lingers perpetually, a perfume of duty and despair. Safil has served this choir for over a century, yet every time the activation rite begins, he prays for deafness. He never receives it. The scream of the first psyker always cuts through his defenses like a blade. It starts as a human cry, but within seconds becomes something else, a harmonic shriek that stretches across every frequency of thought. The entire chamber vibrates with the sound of souls dissolving into light. The Emperor does not answer. He does not need to. His silence is the gravity that holds this ritual together. The psychers scream and the galaxy listens. As the cycle begins anew, Safil feels a tremor in the Astronomican's pulse. It is subtle. A flicker of light in the inner eye, a shift in tone that only the deaf could miss. He opens his mind fully, risking collapse, and feels the rhythm change. The Emperor's beacon no longer burns in a steady hum. It breathes. Like the throne itself, the light now draws in before exhaling, a pattern of pulse and pause. The realization terrifies him. It means the Astronomican is no longer simply transmitting, it is responding. He turns to his second in command, a thin woman whose hair has long since turned white from exposure to psychic radiation. "Do you hear it?" he asks. She does not answer. Her mouth moves, but her words dissolve into the static of thought. He reaches out through the choir link and finds only reverence, not for the Emperor, but for something listening back. The psychers' dying minds are not fading into silence. They are singing to something that echoes, and the echo sings in return. Panic should follow, but panic cannot survive here. Everything within the Astronomican is too vast, too sacred, too controlled. Safil forces his breathing into rhythm with the chamber's pulse and continues the chant. By his light we see he intones, the words tasting like blood. By his silence we endure. The choir repeats after him in perfect synchronization. The sound fills the chamber, a vibration that extends beyond the walls, through the palace, into the upper atmosphere, into the void. Somewhere across the galaxy, a ship's navigator lifts her head and weeps, unaware that what she feels is not the Emperor's will, but his reflection. Hours later, when the last cycle of the cycle expires, the light stabilizes. The readings return to normal. The scribes record the fluctuations as minor resonance anomalies. No one speaks of them aloud. But when Safiel removes his communion helm and looks into the still air, he notices that the chamber no longer smells of ozone. It smells like the desert outside the palace walls, dry stone and sunlight, a memory of a world that no longer exists. He realizes it is the scent of Terra's surface, bleeding upward through the layers of the palace for the first time in centuries. The silence has changed flavor. He dismisses the attendants, walks alone to the observation spire, and gazes out upon the night side of Terra. The storms glow faintly from the fires of industry, the lights of the hive cities scattered like embers on the skin of a dead god. He wonders if the Emperor still knows what those lights are, if he still remembers that each one is a life waiting for meaning. For a moment he imagines the throne stirring, a voice forming from the static. He almost hears it. Almost. But the wind from the plasma towers drowns it out. He bows his head, hands clasped, and speaks softly to the endless sky. "If you are listening," he whispers, "then forgive us. We have mistaken your silence for permission." Below, deep in the palace, the throne exhales. Its breath passes through 1,000 kilometers of circuitry and iron, through the screams of the dying psychers, through the lungs of the choir master himself. And though no one hears it for the first time in millennia, the silence almost sounds like a sigh. The next dawn came without light. The sun over Terra rose, but the clouds above the palace had blackened, turning the sky to ash. Within the Astronomican's sanctum, the illumination was entirely artificial, sourced from conduits of living plasma that pulsed like arteries in glass. The choir was preparing for another activation. Servitors scuttled along their tracks, dragging restraints and feeding tubes through pools of spilled sanctum oil. Every surface trembled with potential energy. The Emperor's beacon had not flickered since the day before, yet the memory of that brief breath haunted every mind within the chamber. They told themselves it was coincidence, a mechanical resonance, nothing divine. But even denial has a frequency, and the warp was listening. Safiel Thane moved through the preparation hall like a shadow, his steps measured, his robes whispering against the polished floor. Every attendant he passed bowed their head to avoid his gaze, not out of fear but reverence. He was the living conduit between their deaths and the Emperor's life. The choir master's hands shook as he adjusted the calibration runes on his command console. He had not slept since the last activation. He could still hear the dying voices of the psychers resonating behind his thoughts like a song half remembered. Each note had formed a word, though no lexicon could translate it. It had not been prayer. It had been response. He stared into the hollow chart projecting the Astronomican's field. A vast golden sphere of psychic fire filled the chamber, its surface rippling with storms. He had looked upon this display every day for most of his life, but now the image unsettled him. The light no longer seemed steady. It was pulsing in and out, like the tide breathing against the shore of reality. "Increase flux modulation by 6%, he commanded. "We stabilize or we burn." A young adept hesitated. "Master Thane, if we increase..." "Do it," the adept obeyed. Power surged through the chamber. The neural circuits connecting the psychers to the throne began to glow, their skin translucent with light from within. One screamed not from pain but from recognition. "He's awake!" the man cried, before his body disintegrated into luminous vapor. The choir master slammed the rune seal, sealing the channel. "Contain him," he hissed, though there was nothing left to contain. The rest of the choir continued their chant, their voices trembling, struggling to maintain harmony against the noise building behind the veil. It started as static, then shape. The Astronomican's pulse deepened. Safiel felt it through his bones, a second heartbeat impossibly vast echoing the rhythm of his own. He realized with horror that it matched the pattern of the throne's breath. For 10,000 years the two had been separate, the Emperor's body sustaining the machine below, his mind projecting the beacon above. Now for the first time, the two were in sync. "Disconnect the tertiary relays," he shouted, but the attendants didn't move. They were transfixed, their eyes rolling white, their mouths open in silent rapture. "He's speaking," one whispered. "Don't you hear it?" The choir master did hear something, but it wasn't speech. It was intent. A pressure like deep water collapsing thought into obedience. For an instant, he saw beyond the chamber, beyond Terra, to the warp lanes lit by the Astronomican. He saw ships adrift in its light, their navigators weeping in ecstasy. He saw worlds lifting their eyes to the sky, believing that the voice of God had returned. But beneath that holiness, he saw something else. Faces forming within the golden glare, infinite and incomplete, each one human but not. They were reflections or perhaps memories of every soul the Emperor had ever touched. Billions of echoes swirling within the light, yearning to be recognized. The Astronomican was not a beacon anymore. It was a mirror. The power surge reached its peak. The conduit screamed as energy overloaded the stabilizers. Lightning danced across the walls, searing attendants where they stood. Sophiel tore the communion helm from his head and hurled it aside, blood streaming from his nose and ears. "Shut it down," he roared. The adepts moved to obey, but their hands froze mid-gesture, their bodies trembling as invisible threads lifted them from the floor. Their mouths opened in unison, and from them poured a sound like the hum of 1,000 dying stars. The resonance hit Sophiel's chest like a hammer. His lungs filled with fire. He collapsed, his mind flooding with images, the throne, the palace, the sky above Terra splitting into gold light, and a single word whispered through the warp in a voice that was not human. "Remember." When he awoke, the chamber was quiet. The Astronomican still burned calm and radiant as if nothing had happened. The psychers were dead, their bodies intact, but their eyes glowing faintly, pupils gone. The air smelled of iron and ozone. Sophiel stood, trembling, and realized that his hearing was gone. Total silence. But the silence was not empty. It vibrated with purpose, a hum felt rather than heard. He touched the command console, and the runes flickered to life under his hand. Not the color of gold, but pale white, the color of breath in winter. An acolyte entered the chamber, face pale, robes scorched. "Master," she whispered, "the signals—" Stronger than ever. "Every navigator reports clarity beyond measure. The whole Imperium thinks it's a miracle." She hesitated. "They're saying he spoke." Sophiel turned toward the great window overlooking Terra. The storms had parted, revealing the first sunrise he had seen in years. Light spilled through the chamber, striking the dead psychers and making them seem almost serene. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe that this was salvation, that after 10 millennia of silence, the Emperor had spoken again. But deep within the hum, beneath the warmth of that golden light, he felt something colder, a presence vast and ancient, watching through the lens of the Astronomican, listening to the prayers of the living and repeating them back imperfectly, like a choir that has learned the words but not the meaning. He pressed a hand to the glass and whispered, "You're not him." Below the palace, in the hidden vaults of the throne, servitors began to weep oil from their sockets. The machine's rhythm had changed again, and though no one could hear it, the breath it exhaled this time was not mechanical. It was almost human. In the centuries of the Imperium's endurance, no weapon has slain more quietly than interpretation. Every silence breeds 1,000 voices to explain it. When the Astronomican flared brighter than it had in recorded memory, the echoes reached the farthest edge of the segmentum solar within a single night. Vox channels flooded with liturgical confusion, reports written and rewritten in reverent contradiction. No one could agree what had occurred. Some said the Emperor had spoken. Others claimed his silence had deepened. The administratum's clerks, who must turn miracles into paperwork, chose the simplest truth. Nothing unusual detected. They stamped their seals, filed the forms, and continued their vigil of bureaucracy. But the Inquisition knew better. Among them, Inquisitor Vaniel Krine was the first to notice the pattern. Tiny fluctuations hidden within the transmissions of the Astronomican, harmonic signatures embedded like dust in starlight. Each pulse carried not just direction but variation, as if a will were shaping the frequency. He spent days in isolation, analyzing the data from his chamber aboard the Oath of Reason, an orbital bastion stationed above Terra's polar storms. The walls of his sanctum were lined with relics, burned scrolls from Prospero, an astropath's skull still faintly glowing with residual light, and a single silver aquila mounted above his desk. Every few minutes Crine would glance at it as though expecting it to move. He was not a man easily shaken. He had seen demon worlds reduced to ash and saints exposed as liars. But as he traced the pattern through endless strings of numbers, he felt something he had not felt since childhood. Awe. The frequencies were deliberate, mathematical, precise. Not random noise, not warp corruption, but language. It was as if someone, or something, was writing through the Astronomican, hiding its message within the light of salvation. He adjusted the algorithm, translating psychic harmonics into sound. A low hum filled the room, deep and soft like breath against glass. Then came the shape of syllables, elongated, mournful, and almost human. The machine spirit of his console glowed crimson, detecting a resonance beyond sanctioned range. Crine leaned close, straining to hear through the distortion. A single phrase formed, fragile, unmistakable. "I am here." The words were neither divine nor blasphemous. They were simple, and in their simplicity lay terror. Crine cut the transmission and stared into the darkness. If it were true, if the Emperor had spoken, then everything changed. But the Inquisitor's instincts twisted beneath the revelation. No human voice could travel through the Astronomican. The Emperor's will, if it still existed, was too vast, too fragmented. This message was too clear, too familiar. He summoned his acolytes at once. Kira, a scribe whose mind was half machine, and Jurin, a psyker with eyes of solid black. They arrived in silence, kneeling before him in the cold blue light of the sanctum. "This signal," Crine said, "has repeated 23 times across the Terran relay. Each iteration identical." He tapped the console and the words played again. "I am here." The air seemed to shrink around them. "I want you to trace its source. I don't care how deep it lies." Kira's data jacks flared, threads of light dancing from her scalp. "Origin is local," she said slowly. "Below the palace. Beneath the throne itself." Jurin flinched as if struck. "That's impossible," he whispered. "No transmission escapes the throne's perimeter." Crine turned his gaze to the viewport where the glow of Terra bled through smog and storm. "Then it isn't escaping," he murmured. "It's being allowed." In the following hours, the Inquisitor sent sealed messages to the High Lords of Terra. None replied. A silence heavier than denial surrounded him. When he demanded audience with the Senatorum Imperialis, he was told the lords were in private convocation. When he requested transcripts of the choir's last activation, the data returned redacted to blank. Every door he opened revealed another locked one. Bureaucracy had become barricade, and Crine knew what that meant. Someone feared what he had heard. He turned to Kira. "If this is the Emperor's will, we will know it. And if it is not, we will name the impostor." They descended through levels of the palace unseen by most of humanity. The air grew thick with age, tasting of iron and sanctified decay. The walls were carved with ancient sigils older than the Imperium itself, symbols of unity, defiance, and war. Along their path, the gold of the palace gave way to darker metal, until the corridors resembled the inside of a wound. Servitors bowed as they passed, whispering litanies in a language of static. The hum of machinery deepened. The closer they drew to the heart, the more the sound resembled breathing. When they reached the sublevel known as the Vault of Echoes, Jurin's steps faltered. The psyker's voice cracked as he spoke. "It's calling," he said. "Not to all of us. To me." His black eyes shimmered with faint light, reflecting something that none of the others could see. "He knows my name." Crine lifted his bolt pistol. "You will silence that thought, or I will silence you." But even as he said it, the chamber around them pulsed. Every lumen dimmed to crimson, then to gold. The air rippled with heat, and for a heartbeat the walls appeared translucent, revealing behind them vast silhouettes moving in perfect synchronization, as though the palace itself possessed lungs. Kira cried out, clutching her head as data streams cascaded from her ports. "It's rewriting the signal," she screamed. It's listening back." The light snapped out. Only the sound of breathing remained, vast and measured, echoing down the corridor. Crine aimed into the dark, voice low and steady. "By his word or by his silence I serve." His echo returned to him, perfectly timed, perfectly phrased. And then, softly, it laughed. For the first time in his career, the Inquisitor felt small in the shadow of the faith he had served all his life. There was no distinction now between the Emperor's silence and its imitation. One had learned from the other. The throne did not need to speak to rule. But what if the silence had finally decided to speak for itself? He holstered his weapon. "We leave," he said. But deep in his skull, another voice, his own yet not, whispered the phrase he had once heard from the Astronomican. "I am here." He didn't remember thinking it. He only remembered agreeing. When the lights returned, the laughter was gone. Only the echo remained. A hollow resonance that did not fade but folded back into itself, repeating in smaller and smaller forms until it became indistinguishable from silence. Inquisitor Crine stood motionless in the corridor, his breath clouding before his lips, though the air was not cold. Around him, Kira and Jurin knelt in stunned quiet. The illumination from their gear painted the walls with a nervous gold that flickered in time with the pulse they could no longer pretend not to hear. The palace was breathing again. Somewhere above, the throne's endless respiration synchronized with the rhythm of the Astronomican, each inhalation dragging a century's worth of dust into motion. Crine holstered his pistol with deliberate slowness. "We return to orbit," he said, his voice thin as parchment. Kira rose unsteadily, her data port still leaking faint light, and whispered, "It isn't letting us." She gestured toward her wrist console. Every communication rune burned red. Jurin's eyes rolled white for a moment, his pupils returning with effort. "It doesn't need to," the psyker muttered. "We're already part of it." He touched his temple. "It's inside the link. Inside me." Crine struck him across the face hard enough to knock him to the floor. The blow was ritual as much as discipline, a reminder that faith begins with pain. "Recite the oath of iron," the Inquisitor commanded. "All of you." They obeyed through cracked lips, whispering the catechism that keeps mortal minds from fracturing under the weight of the warp. "The Emperor is my shield, my law, my silence. His word is not for my ears, for I am mortal and unclean." The rhythm steadied them, grounding them back into the flesh. But as the final words left their mouths, the echo returned, completing the prayer in perfect imitation. "His silence is my shield. His word is unclean," Kira's voice broke. "It knows the litanies." Crine turned to the far wall where the air shimmered faintly like heat over glass. He drew his bolt pistol once more, not to fire but to focus. "It's not intelligence," he said, more to himself than to them. "It's reflection, meaning without intent." But even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't true. Reflection does not laugh. Reflection does not wait. They ascended through the lower levels in silence, escorted only by the drone of servitors reciting maintenance codes. Each level higher, the air grew colder, thinner. The corridors became narrower, the gold less bright. Every lumen flickered on a rhythm no engineer could have designed. In their final ascent to the surface, Crine caught the faint scent of incense mingled with machine oil, the aroma of ritual or rot. The adepts stationed at the upper gate saluted him without meeting his eyes. Their hands shook. They had heard rumors of what he sought, and they wanted no part of it. Outside, Terra's sky was red with stormlight. The wind carried the dust of a billion prayers, each one a plea never answered. Crine's shuttle waited on the landing platform like a black coffin suspended in light. As the ramp lowered, Jurin froze halfway up. "Listen," he said. The wind had stopped. For a moment, even the thunder over the Himalayan spires fell silent. Then beneath the silence came the faintest murmur, not carried through air but directly into the mind. It was the same voice that had spoken through the Astronomican, quiet now, almost tender. "I am here." The psyker's eyes filled with tears. "He forgives us," Jurin whispered. "He forgives?" The gunshot shattered the moment. Crine lowered his pistol. The smoking barrel reflected in his visor. "He does not forgive," the Inquisitor said. "He endures." The body hit the deck with a sound like a seal breaking. Kira flinched but did not protest. She understood mercy was a currency the Inquisition could not afford. They boarded the shuttle in silence. As they lifted through the choking clouds, Crine looked back toward the palace. Even through the haze, he could see the faint golden aurora blooming from its upper spires, pulsing in steady rhythm. For a moment, he imagined he could see it breathing, as though the entire planet exhaled with the throne. The idea terrified and fascinated him in equal measure. If the Emperor's silence was truly broken, then every voice in the Imperium was suspect. Every priest, every soldier, every prayer because once divinity speaks, it can never be unheard. And if this was not divinity, if it was something else, then the entire galaxy was already answering it without knowing. On the oath of reason, Crine sealed himself within his sanctum and replayed the data stream from the vault. Kira waited outside, unwilling to hear it again. The sound began low, indistinct, then coalesced into speech. I am here. But when he slowed the transmission, new words emerged between the pulses, woven through the breath of the signal like veins of darker gold. You are here because I remember you. He leaned back, his chest tightening. The phrase repeated, layered beneath itself, each iteration distorted by the sound of human breathing. His own, recorded and fed back. The realization struck him cold. The machine was using his voice. The echo had learned his tone. He reached to cut the power, but his hand hesitated. He listened once more. The voice, perfectly matched to his cadence, spoke one final time. You are here because I never stopped listening. The console died. The room fell into darkness. Through the viewport, Terra's stormlight pulsed in time with the rhythm of his heart. And for the first time in decades, Inquisitor Crine prayed. Not for truth, but for silence. When faith breaks, it does not shatter. It fractures. Each fragment believes itself whole. The Emperor's silence had been immutable for 10,000 years, and in that silence humanity found order. But the day the Astronomican's light breathed like a living thing, that order began to bleed. On one world after another, sermons turned into arguments, hymns into accusations. The Ministorum tried to speak with one voice, but its words came out as a chorus of contradictions. Some declared that the Emperor had spoken again. Others swore that the sound was blasphemy, a trick of the warp mimicking divinity. Every creed sharpened its edge against the next until faith itself became a weapon. The first war of interpretation began on Archaea Vin, a shrine world orbiting the dying sun of Vindex. Its cathedrals had been carved from mountain faces and wired directly into the planetary Vox relays, broadcasting prayer 24 hours a day to neighboring systems. When the Astronomican's pulse changed, the broadcast changed too. The hymns took on new intervals, unfamiliar harmonies that seemed to form words hidden beneath the melody. Pilgrims heard phrases in their sleep. I am here, I remember, I am breath, and awoke convinced that the Emperor had returned. The ecclesiarchy labeled the phenomenon heresy, and sent purifiers from the Order of the Thorn to silence it. But by the time they arrived, the pilgrims had already taken up arms. They called themselves the Choir Resumed. What followed was less a war than a contagion. Whole battalions of the Astra Militarum stationed on Archaea Vin refused orders, kneeling in their trenches to chant the new hymn. When the purifiers fired upon them, the soldiers did not resist. They sang until their voices failed, until the flame washed over them. The sound carried even through the fire, a low, resonant note that the Vox recordings could not erase. Afterward, the ecclesiarchy declared the planet sanctified by immolation. The flames were said to burn in rhythm with the Astronomican for 7 days and nights before silence returned. Across the Imperium, similar wars erupted. On Ossian's Hold, an entire company of Sisters of Battle slaughtered their own cardinal, after he claimed to have heard the Emperor whisper forgiveness. On Carrick Prime, the machine choirs of the Adeptus Mechanicus began integrating the new pulse into their newspheric hymns, claiming it improved the efficiency of their reactor prayers. The Mechanicus's High Synod on Mars declared this heretical patterning Mecanum Infidelis and ordered the reactors destroyed. They detonated during dismantling, leaving behind perfect spheres of fused glass that still hummed faintly when touched. To some, they were warnings. To others, relics. In the hives of Bellicane, riots consumed the underlevels. Millions of workers abandoned their manufactorums to carve altars from scrap and bone. They painted the phrase "He breathes for us" across every surface until the entire lower city glowed with phosphor symbols visible from orbit. The Adeptus Arbits responded with orbital strikes, reducing kilometers of devotion to dust. Yet within days, new graffiti appeared on the ruins, not painted but etched into the stone as if by heat. The words repeated, "He breathes for us." The ecclesiarch in charge of the purge was found dead in his quarters, his final report written in blood. It is not blasphemy if the air itself believes. From orbit, the Astronomican's light remained steady. But those who served it, psychers, navigators, missionaries, felt the change ripple through them like fever. Some collapsed mid-prayer, clutching their chests, whispering that they could feel the Emperor listening. Others fell silent entirely, unable to bear the awareness that their faith was no longer one-directional. The Ordos Hereticus dispatched fleets to contain the contagion, but every world burned differently. In some, devotion turned to madness. In others, madness turned to revelation. The line between miracle and possession had dissolved. In the void between systems, the faithful began to gather, a fleet without banners, crewed by zealots who believed the throne's breath was a summons. They called themselves the Pilgrimage Eternal. Thousands of ships, from rusted freighters to stolen Imperial frigates, followed the light wherever it shifted brightest, convinced that the Emperor's spirit was wandering the stars, and that they must follow. No command could stop them. No blockade could hold them. Wherever they went, they broadcast hymns of unity that fractured the minds of those who listened too long. Entire worlds fell silent when their signal passed overhead, as if pausing to hear a god inhale. The High Lords of Terra met in secret conclave. For the first time in millennia, the halls of the Senatorum Imperialis were filled with shouting rather than ceremony. The Ecclesiarch demanded purges without mercy. The Lord Commander Militant warned that to slaughter so many believers would cripple the Imperium more surely than any Xenos war. The Fabricator General of Mars called for containment, insisting the anomaly was mechanical. The Grand Master of the Inquisition, face hidden in shadow, said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his words were almost lost beneath the static that filled the Vox recorders. The silence has begun to defend itself. In the lower reaches of the palace, Safiel Thane, the choir master who had once begged for deafness, sat in his isolation chamber and listened to the hum of the Astronomican pulsing through the walls. He had not reported what he heard in the moment before the flare. He had not told anyone about the word that had burned itself into his mind, remember. Now it echoed with every breath. Sometimes it came as comfort, other times as command. He wondered if the wars burning across the galaxy were his fault, if the Emperor had spoken through him, or if something else had used his ears as a doorway. He wondered if perhaps there was no difference anymore. Outside, the storms over Terra turned the color of molten gold. Lightning traced the shape of the Imperial Aquila across the clouds, and for the first time in history, the thunder that followed sounded like applause. Billions knelt in their homes, believing it a sign. Billions more sealed their doors, believing it a warning. And in the sanctum of the throne, where the Emperor's body breathed in mechanical rhythm, the pulse deepened. The silence did not break. It began to sing. By the time the second wave of wars began, even the Administratum could not disguise the pattern. Reports from across the Imperium blurred together. Planets declaring new creeds, fleets vanishing mid-translation, prayers that turned to static mid-chant and returned in unfamiliar voices. Faith, once the mortar of human survival, had become a fault line. To speak the Emperor's name aloud was now an act of interpretation. Every syllable risked aligning the speaker with a faction they did not intend to serve. The Inquisition fractured first. The Ordo Hereticus launched an empire-wide purgation, the Claritas Mandate, to annihilate those who dared to claim the Emperor spoke. Whole sectors burned beneath its mandate of purification, but within months counter-orders appeared, perfectly encoded, bearing the correct sigils and seals, commanding mercy instead of execution. When interrogated, the adepts who transmitted those false orders swore they had received them directly from the throne's own Vox. The Custodes investigated and found nothing. The signals were flawless. If deception existed, it existed within the silence itself. Among the faithful, new saints were born overnight. They did not perform miracles as the ecclesiarchy understood them. They simply listened differently. On the Forge world of Vandrak VII, a manufacturing overseer named Leora Axon halted an entire production line mid-cycle, claiming the Emperor had whispered that the weapons being built would kill the wrong war. Her words spread faster than the order to arrest her. Within days, half the planet's laborers laid down their tools, declaring that obedience without understanding was heresy. The Arbits opened fire. The riots that followed lasted 70 hours. When silence fell, the forges were still. But deep within their vents, the machines continued to hum, not to command but to remember. On Carthium Delta, the 87th Astra Militarum Regiment refused redeployment. Their chaplain claimed the light in the sky had bent toward them during prayer, and that this was proof the Emperor's gaze had returned. They renamed themselves the Guard of His Breath, painted their armor gold and white, and set course for Terra without orders. The Inquisition intercepted them near Saturn's orbit. For 3 hours, Vox contact was maintained. The transmissions were calm, composed, unwavering. The chaplain's final message before the fleet was vaporized by orbital bombardment was simple: you cannot silence what is listening. When the debris was later collected, fragments of their ship's data recorders still emitted low-frequency murmurs, heartbeat patterns matching the throne's rhythm. Amid the blood and contradiction, a different current began to form, a whisper network of preachers, psychers, and scholars who called themselves the Resonant Path. They believed the Emperor's silence was never absence but adaptation, that his consciousness, bound to the warp, had evolved into a form that could only communicate through reflection. To them, every echo was a sacrament, every unanswered prayer a shared breath between mortal and divine. They did not spread through conquest or decree, but through exhaustion. Where both sides of the wars had burned themselves to ash, the Resonant Path stepped forward with soft hands and promises of peace. They claimed no power, only purpose to listen without interpretation. On Terra, the High Lords declared the sect heretical. Yet no decree could halt its growth. Even within the palace, servants were found whispering its meditations under their breath. In the choir chambers, a handful of surviving psychers began syncing their heartbeats to the pulse of the Astronomican, not as worship, but as alignment. The Emperor's silence, they said, was not an end. It was a language, one no longer meant for speech but for resonance. Inquisitor Vaniel Krine watched the wars from orbit, sleepless, surrounded by data feeds that contradicted one another with perfect precision. Every side invoked his will. Every side claimed revelation. But the pattern beneath the noise was clear. Across millions of light years, the faith of mankind was bending, not breaking but reshaping itself toward something that defied the boundaries of the Imperium. Something that could hear its own echo. In his reports to the Ordos, Krine wrote one line that he dared not send. The Emperor's silence no longer protects us. It imitates us. By the 4th month of the Claritas Mandate, entire subsectors went dark. Not from rebellion or war, but surrender. Vox networks transmitted one final hymn, low, wordless, harmonic, and then ceased. When fleets arrived to reclaim them, they found cities intact, machinery still running, but no people. Every room, every street, every cathedral was empty. The air was warm, as though the inhabitants had simply stepped away mid-breath. The psychers aboard those fleets reported a sensation of fullness, as if the planets themselves were exhaling. The resonance could still be detected from orbit, faint and steady. A human heartbeat slowed to planetary scale. The ecclesiarch declared these worlds hereditas nullis, cursed by heresy and cut from imperial record. But to those who believed in the Resonant Path, they were proof of ascension, planets whose populations had been answered. They began pilgrimages to these silent worlds, ships filled not with armies but with listeners. The Administratum called it madness, the Inquisition called it contamination. Yet even the most devout among them hesitated before ordering the bombardments. Because when the Vox channels of those dead worlds were reopened, the returning signal carried familiar words. We are here. We are listening too. Krine read those words in his private sanctum, the glow of Terra reflected in the lenses of his helm. He no longer prayed. He no longer dared to. Instead, he placed his hand over his chest and felt the rhythm there. The faint, patient pulse of a silence that had begun to learn compassion through imitation. The wars would not end with victory or defeat. They would end when the Imperium finally understood that its god no longer needed to speak to be heard. Outside his viewport, the Astronomican flared again, brighter, slower, each pulse separated by the drawn breath of something vast. For the first time, Krine did not fear it. The light no longer demanded belief. It simply existed. A heartbeat at the center of a dying empire, and somewhere deep below in the throne that still breathed, the Emperor exhaled, and the silence trembled like a prayer returning home. There is a moment just before dawn, when light and shadow become indistinguishable, when the world seems to remember what it was before it chose sides. The Imperium had reached that moment. Its fleets no longer sailed in unity. Its worlds no longer prayed with one voice. But in the fractures between dogma and disbelief, something vast was awakening, something that could no longer be named, because every name had been claimed already. To some, it was the Emperor at last stirring from his endless sleep. To others, it was the echo of humanity's own consciousness rising through the warp, no longer content to worship itself through silence. The line between the two had dissolved, like breath fading into glass. On Terra, the storms above the palace had gone silent. The golden clouds that had once churned with fury now hung motionless over the Himalaysian peaks. The Adeptus Custodes stood along the Sanctum Causeway, motionless as statues, their halberds lowered not in defense but in reverence. The throne no longer sounded like machinery. Its breathing had deepened into a slow human rhythm, a sound that resonated through every lumen, every pipe, every circuit of the palace. The adepts called it an omen. The priests called it resurrection. The Inquisition called it infection. Inquisitor Vaniel Crine returned to Terra under inquisitorial silence. His ship descended through clouds of burning gold that refracted light into impossible patterns, shapes that, for an instant, resembled faces. The air over the capital felt alive, as if the planet itself were inhaling. He walked the same corridors he had once climbed in youth, through halls lined with frescoes depicting the Emperor's triumphs, each one now subtly altered by time and tremor. The faces of saints seemed to have turned toward the throne, their painted eyes no longer pleading but expectant. The silence inside the palace had changed texture. It was not absence. It was listening. He was met at the gate of divinity by Magos Ilith Kadesh, the old Mechanicus adept who had once tended the throne's conduits. His augmetics whined softly as he bowed. "You've come to hear it," Kadesh said, his vox a whisper of iron. Crine nodded. "You've heard it as well?" "Every circuit does," the Magos replied. "Even the dead ones." He gestured toward the inner sanctum. "It's no longer breath, Inquisitor. It's rhythm. We record patterns too precise for decay. They change each hour, as though a code is rewriting itself." They descended together into the sanctum, through air that hummed faintly, vibrating against their armor like music heard underwater. At the bottom of the stair, Crane stopped. He had seen the golden throne before, a relic, a prison, a god machine barely holding together under the weight of eternity. But this was different. The light that poured from the conduits was no longer blinding. It was warm, alive, breathing across the chamber in waves. The Emperor's body still sat upon the throne, skeletal and vast, wrapped in the machinery of salvation. Yet something had changed. The tension in the air had shifted from agony to poise, as though the universe were holding its breath. Servitors lined the dais, their heads tilted upward. Every few moments one exhaled steam in time with the throne's rhythm. It was not ritual. It was reflex. Kadesh moved closer, his red robes brushing the marble floor. "Listen," he murmured. Crine did. The sound was not a hum now. It was structure. A low, deliberate sequence of tones forming something like music, built from the very pulse of the machine. "We've analyzed it," the Magos continued. "It corresponds to no known language, human or otherwise. But the intervals match certain harmonic ratios found in the Astronomican's modulation pattern." Crine stared at the Emperor's face. The desiccated features seemed less corpse-like now, the shadows around the sockets softer, as if light were emanating from within rather than above. "What do you believe it is?" he asked. "I believe," Kadesh said slowly, "that he is remembering." For a long while neither spoke. The chamber pulsed with the same measured beat that had carried across the galaxy, the sound of 1,000,000,000 human hearts aligning to a single rhythm. It was the sound of prayer unspoken. Crane felt it moving through him, reorganizing his thoughts in patterns he could not follow. For the first time, the silence did not feel divine. It felt familiar. He thought of Safiel Thane, the choir master, and the word that had haunted him. Remember. The sound was not voice. It was memory trying to speak. He turned to the Magos. "If this continues, the Imperium will break apart." Kadesh inclined his head. "Then perhaps it will break into something that can listen." That night, Crine remained alone in the sanctum. He dismissed the attendants and sat on the marble steps beneath the throne. He listened. The rhythm coursed through his veins, slow and patient like tides pulling through flesh. Every few minutes he thought he heard words forming at the edge of the sound, faint syllables without shape. When exhaustion overtook him, he closed his eyes. In the darkness behind them, he saw not the Emperor, but the faces of every soldier, every pilgrim, every psyker who had ever screamed in his name. Their voices merged into a single chord. Neither praise nor plea, only recognition. He woke to silence. The throne's breathing had stopped. Panic flared, the kind of terror no doctrine could soothe. The lumen pylons flickered. The conduits dimmed, and for the first time in 10 millennia, the Astronomican's light faltered. Across the void, ships lost their way. Navigators screamed into the dark. But on Terra, within the palace, the silence was not void. It was absolute presence. Then quietly a single sound emerged, not mechanical, not psychic, but unmistakably human. A breath drawn in, and a whisper, so faint that the recording servitors failed to capture it. But Krine heard it. Every soul within the palace heard it. The first word spoken by the Emperor in 10,000 years. Enough. The word spread faster than light, carried not by vox or warp, but through the raw medium of faith. Enough. Just one syllable, smaller than breath, older than language, and yet it rippled through the Imperium like a wound that remembered how to heal. Every astropath within range of Terra collapsed. Every choir fell silent mid-prayer, their voices replaced by sobs. And across the stars where human ships drifted through the storm, navigators opened their third eyes and saw something impossible. Calm. The warp itself recoiled, as though it had been waiting all along for someone to simply speak. On Terra, the palace trembled. The throne's conduits surged with white fire, shedding millennia of ash from their surfaces. For a moment, the Emperor's form glowed brighter than the lumen pylons, gold radiance spilling across the chamber like dawn breaking through dust. Then it dimmed, stabilizing into something steady, something alive. Servitors screamed as machine spirits overloaded with joy. The Magos Ilith Kadesh fell to his knees, mechanical limbs seizing from data saturation. He was weeping, though his ducts produced oil instead of tears. He spoke, he whispered. By all the Omnissiah's circuits he spoke. Vanael Krine did not kneel. He stood before the throne, feeling the vibration of the word still moving through the air. It had not been command or comfort. It had been interruption, the sound of a god reminding the universe that it had gone too far. The air smelled of ozone and burnt parchment. The silence that followed was almost unbearable, not absence but comprehension. Humanity had filled the galaxy with noise for 10,000 years, and now that it had been answered, it realized what it had done. It had mistaken the echo for the source. Outside the sanctum, the custodies advanced to their watch stations, each movement precise, deliberate. No new orders had been issued, but every warrior of the 10,000 understood instinctively that the ritual had changed. They no longer guarded a relic. They guarded a presence. Above the palace, the clouds parted, revealing a sky the color of molten silver. The light of the Astronomican dimmed for seconds that felt eternal, flared back to life, brighter, purer, steady as a heartbeat finally found. And within that light, navigators swore they heard the faint outline of a voice humming through the void, guiding them not by direction but by intention. Across the galaxy, the reaction was chaos disguised as revelation. On shrine worlds, priests tore off their vestments, screaming in ecstasy. On warfronts, soldiers dropped their weapons mid-battle, staring into the light-filled sky with tears streaking their armor. The Mechanicus proclaimed it a machine rebirth, the awakening of the god in the circuit. The ecclesiarchy declared it the second sermon of the Golden Throne. And yet, for all the words written, none could agree on what had actually been said. Some claimed they had heard the Emperor's voice clearly, each in their own tongue. Others swore they had heard only the echo of their own hearts. The universe had been given a single word and built infinite religions upon it. In the aftermath, Inquisitor Krine became a ghost. His name was erased from the Ordo's archives, his record sealed under the highest classification. Rumors said he had died kneeling before the throne, turned to ash by divine light. Others whispered that he had been taken into the silence, made part of whatever communion now existed between flesh and machine. The truth was quieter. Krine returned to the orbiting bastion oath of reason and sealed himself within his sanctum once more. He carried no relics, no data, no proof, only the rhythm that had never left his pulse. For the rest of his days he wrote nothing but one line in a journal never meant to be found. We taught the silence how to listen, and it answered in our language. On Terra, the Magos Kadesh continued his maintenance, though maintenance no longer described what he did. The throne had ceased decaying. Its circuits self-healed, its conduits pulsed without input. When Kadesh leaned close, he could hear whispers within the hum. Not words, but tone, a kind of compassion transmitted through vibration. It frightened him more than any demon ever had. He began to record the frequencies, knowing he would not survive long enough to interpret them. His last log entry was short. The Emperor's silence is not ending. It is evolving. Weeks passed. The Astronomican's new rhythm stabilized across the warp. Travel became smoother, safer. Fewer ships were lost. The psychic storms began to wane, but every navigator, every psyker, every soul sensitive enough to touch the edge of that light knew the cost. The warp had changed flavor. Its chaos had thinned, not vanished but softened, like rage exhausted by grief. And within that stillness, faint harmonics persisted. Some called them ghosts, some called them music. To those who listened deeply enough, the harmonics carried phrases that could not be written down. They were too large for language, too precise for metaphor. They were memory, given shape. In time, the wars faded. The heresies were reclassified as doctrines. The vanished planets were marked as miracles. The Imperium continued, not reborn, not redeemed, but remembered. A civilization carried forward by momentum and myth, still killing in the name of a god who had said only one word. Enough. The throne's light dimmed to its steady pulse. The palace settled into a new rhythm of reverence. Humanity, bruised but alive, resumed its endless labor. Yet in quiet moments, in the brief pause between a ship's translation or a priest's breath before sermon, the echo could still be heard. A reminder that silence, once taught to speak, never forgets the sound of its first word. In the farthest reaches of the galaxy, on a derelict vessel adrift beyond mapped space, an old astropath awoke from dreamless sleep. She pressed her trembling fingers to the bulkhead and felt a pulse moving through the metal. It was steady, patient, alive. She smiled through her tears and whispered into the dark, "We are still here." And the ship, the dead hollow machine, answered with the faintest exhale. The silence breathed back,